Was it quiet afternoon in the city, the kind of day that felt almost ordinary, the sunlight soft against the streets, and a slight breeze making the leaves on the trees sway gently. She was driving home after a long day at the courthouse, the weight of decisions, paperwork, and long hours pressing lightly on her shoulders. She had spent most of the day hearing cases, weighing arguments, and reminding herself why she had worked so hard to become a judge. It had not been an easy journey. Every step had been earned. Every accomplishment fought for against expectations, doubts, and the subtle but persistent barriers that sometimes seemed invisible but always real. As she drove, her mind wandered to small things: what she would make for dinner, a call she needed to return to her sister, the stack of files on her desk that awaited her tomorrow. She took a deep breath, letting herself relax for just a moment, thinking about how ordinary this drive home should be. But life, she knew, sometimes had a way of reminding people that appearances could be deceiving. A flash of red and blue lights reflected in her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened instinctively. She pulled over slowly to the side of the road, careful to signal and find a safe place to stop. She knew the routine: roll down the window, keep hands visible, stay calm. She had been through traffic stops before, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. The officer approached her car with a sharp, almost aggressive step. From the beginning, there was a tension that was difficult to ignore. His eyes seemed to linger a little too long, scanning her with a mixture of suspicion and authority. She offered a polite greeting, her voice calm but firm. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" He didn't answer immediately, just leaned slightly closer to the window, his stance rigid. "You were driving suspiciously," he said, his tone flat but edged with impatience. "I need you to step out of the car." She blinked, a little surprised. "Excuse me?" she asked. "I don't believe I've done anything wrong."
"Can you tell me what I did?"
His voice hardened. "Step out of the vehicle now." Her heart raced, but she did not move hastily. She kept her hands where he could see them, resting lightly on the steering wheel. Around her, the city felt strangely quiet, almost as if the world was holding its breath. She could feel her pulse in her ears, a slow, insistent drum that reminded her to stay calm, to measure her words carefully. She opened her mouth, ready to speak again, to remind him politely that there was no reason for such force. But he had already moved to the side of the car, his hand near his belt, his eyes sharp and unwavering. The street seemed to stretch longer, the moment drawn out as if time itself had slowed. She knew the drill: polite compliance, calm demeanor, careful observation. But something in his posture told her that reason alone might not be enough. She could see it in the way he looked at her, the tightness around his jaw, the flicker of assumption that crossed his face before he hit it. He saw a black woman behind the wheel and had already built a story about her in his mind. And it was not a story she recognized or wanted to be part of. "I assure you, officer," she said gently, her voice steady though her chest tightened. "I am cooperating. Please tell me what the issue is." He stepped closer, his movement sudden and sharp, the kind of movement that makes the air between two people feel charged with tension. "I said step out," he repeated louder this time, his impatience unmistakable. "Do it now." She obeyed, slowly opening the door, placing her feet on the pavement carefully. Her hands were visible the entire time, palms out, the universal sign of peace, of non-aggression. She had been trained to remain calm under pressure, but no amount of training could erase the sting of fear, humiliation, and frustration that surged through her in that moment. As she stepped onto the street, she could see a few passers-by glance over, curiosity evident in their expressions. Some stopped, sensing that something was not quite right. She felt their silent attention like a protective layer, but it was thin and fragile, offering little real safety. The officer circled her slightly, speaking in clipped sentences, issuing orders, his tone tight with authority. "Hands on your head," he commanded. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then complied, placing her hands gently on top of her head, her fingers straight, showing that she was unarmed, unthreatening. Her mind raced. How had a routine drive home turned into this? How could someone see her and assume the worst? She could feel the weight of history in that moment, the centuries of bias, the lingering shadows of prejudice that still touched every interaction, every glance, every assumption. Here she was, a judge, someone who had dedicated her life to justice, to fairness, to making sure others were treated with dignity and respect. And yet none of that seemed to matter to this officer, who saw only a black woman in the narrative he had unconsciously assigned to her. Her voice, calm but firm, cut through the tension. "Officer, I am cooperating. Please explain why this is necessary." For a moment he seemed to hesitate, a flicker of doubt passing over his features, but the moment was brief, quickly replaced by the rigid posture of authority. "You will do as I say," he replied, his voice hard, dismissive. "Now." She remained silent, choosing her words carefully. She knew that speaking too forcefully might escalate the situation. She also knew that any sign of defiance could be twisted into justification for further aggression. Her entire career had taught her the power of measured words, the necessity of patience, and the importance of presence. She drew in a slow breath, letting her calm outwardly mask the storm of emotion inside her. The street seemed to pulse with tension as they stood there, the gap between them charged with unspoken assumptions, fear, and authority. It was a moment that could have gone any number of ways. She could feel every heartbeat, every shift of weight, every glance from the small crowd that had begun to notice. Cameras might be in pockets, phones might be raised, but the immediate reality was the one in front of her. An officer convinced of his power, a woman asserting her right to dignity, and the fragile line that separated compliance from escalation. Her mind traced the long path she had walked to get here, the late nights of study, the sacrifices, the relentless determination to prove herself in spaces where few people looked like her. She had faced bias in courtrooms, in meetings, even in casual interactions, but nothing prepared her for this. This was a collision of authority and assumption, of history and the present, played out on a quiet city street in broad daylight. She reminded herself, silently, to breathe, to keep her posture open but controlled, to maintain the calm that had guided her through countless trials. She refused to let fear dictate her actions. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her unravel. She would not let this moment define her. The officer's voice cut through again, sharper this time, carrying the weight of impatience and the threat of force. "Move to the side of the street." The officer's gaze hardened as he continued to stand beside her, his stance tense, shoulders stiff, as though bracing for some imagined resistance. She felt the air between them thickening, the ordinary afternoon turning heavier with every passing second. Her heart beat steadily, though she could feel a low hum of fear running through her chest. She had faced difficult situations before, but this felt different. It was not about what she had done. It was about how she was perceived, the assumptions hanging like invisible chains around her, tightening with every order he gave. "Hands on the hood," he barked suddenly, his voice cutting sharply through the quiet street. The words carried authority, a demand and a judgment that assumed guilt before evidence. She complied slowly, placing her palms flat on the car, feeling the smooth metal under her hands. Her fingers tensed slightly, the cool surface grounding her as she prepared for whatever came next. She did not speak, did not argue. She knew that words now might be twisted, turned into further justification for what she was experiencing. Around them, a few pedestrians had stopped, sensing the tension in the air. A man across the street paused, his phone half raised as he watched, unsure whether to record or simply observe. A mother walking with her child froze, gripping the child's hand a little tighter, eyes wide. The street, which had seemed calm moments before, now felt like a stage where a drama she did not want to be part of was unfolding. The officer circled her slowly, his boots crunching lightly against the asphalt. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, and intimidating. He glanced at her license and registration, then back at her, his eyes sharp, searching for any sign of weakness or disobedience. She held her position, palms pressed flat, spine straight, her eyes forward. She refused to give him a reaction that could be interpreted as fear or guilt. "Do you know why you're being stopped?" he asked, his voice flat but edged with a hint of impatience, as though the answer could somehow make this less his responsibility. "Yes, officer. I pulled over as soon as I saw your lights," she replied calmly, her tone even, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to speaking in courts, in front of judges, juries, and witnesses. She did not raise her voice. She did not let the frustration seep in. Every word was measured, every syllable chosen carefully. He huffed, shifting his weight. "I said step out of the car. I want you on the sidewalk." She did as instructed, moving slowly, deliberately, keeping her hands in sight at all times. Each step felt heavier than the last, the tension in her chest growing. She could feel the subtle glances of bystanders, the hum of whispers that seemed to vibrate through the air. She did not look at them. She did not need validation or sympathy. She only needed to maintain her composure, to navigate this unjust encounter without losing herself in it. As she reached the sidewalk, the officer suddenly reached for the door, tugging it open more forcefully than necessary as though asserting control. Her calmness did not falter, but her mind raced. She wondered how someone in uniform, someone entrusted with authority, could behave so recklessly, so carelessly, toward someone who posed no threat. She thought of her courtroom, where she upheld the law with fairness, where she demanded respect not because of fear but because of the principles she lived by. Here, on this street, those principles seemed fragile, vulnerable to assumptions and prejudice. "Turn around, hands behind your back," he demanded, his voice rising slightly, impatience and authority mingling. She hesitated for just a moment, considering how to comply while remaining dignified. Slowly, she placed her hands behind her back, palms visible, and turned slightly to the side. Every motion was deliberate, precise, as if she were performing a careful dance where any misstep could be used against her. Her mind catalogued everything: the position of his hands, the angle of his gaze, the way his body moved as though expecting defiance. "Do you have any weapons?" he asked, scanning her again, his tone still sharp. "No, officer," she said clearly. "I have no weapons." Her voice did not waver, though her chest tightened. She felt every pulse of her heartbeat, a reminder of her own vulnerability but also of her strength. She had lived with resilience for decades, and she would not let this moment define her. The officer's eyes flicked over her once more, then back to his notes. His fingers drummed lightly against his belt, a subtle display of impatience or irritation. He glanced around the street where a few more people had now stopped to watch. Some were taking out their phones, unsure whether to step closer or simply bear witness. She did not care about the cameras. She only cared about maintaining her calm, about holding her dignity intact. "You need to be quiet and follow instructions," he said, his voice carrying both warning and accusation. "I am following instructions," she replied softly but firmly. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone used to commanding respect through reason, rather than intimidation. The officer's face hardened. "I need you to face the car and keep your hands where I can see them." She obeyed, pressing her palms lightly against the metal once again. She could feel the cool surface under her hands grounding her, anchoring her in the reality of the moment. Her mind remained sharp, cataloging every movement, every glance, every shift in his stance. She understood the psychology of such encounters. She knew that control often came from perception rather than reason. He circled her again, slow and deliberate, as though expecting resistance that would never come. Her eyes scanned the street only briefly, taking in the few bystanders, the soft hum of city life continuing around them. There was a mother with a stroller nearby, a couple leaning against a building, a man holding a coffee cup, all of them silent witnesses to this tension. She did not acknowledge them. She did not need their validation. Her focus was singular: survive this interaction with dignity intact, and perhaps teach a quiet lesson in respect without uttering a word. Then came the shift that made her heart tighten. The officer reached for his handcuffs. The sudden motion, though practiced and automatic, felt like an escalation, a signal that he intended to assert control physically if necessary. She froze slightly, processing the implicit threat, the expectation that she would comply not just with words but with fear. "I said stay still," he said, his tone sharp, eyes narrowing as he looked down at her hands. She nodded subtly, keeping her hands firmly on the hood of the car. She did not flinch. She did not move hastily. Every part of her told her to remain calm, to maintain composure, to let the moment pass without adding fuel to the fire. She had faced pressure before, had stood in courtrooms where tempers flared and lives were on the line. This was different, yes, because it involved assumptions she could not control, but the principle remained the same. Stay grounded, stay calm, stay present, the officer muttered under his breath, clearly frustrated by the lack of the reaction he expected. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the faint hum of traffic in the distance and the distant voices of people walking by. She felt every second, every heartbeat, every subtle shift in the officer's stance. She knew that this was more than a traffic stop. This was a confrontation between perception and reality, authority and dignity, assumption and truth. A small crowd had now gathered, sensing that the encounter had escalated beyond a routine stop. Phones were raised, whispers exchanged, but she did not engage. She did not need the witness of strangers to validate her existence or her rights. Her calm presence was her statement, a quiet assertion that she would not be diminished or intimidated. The officer's voice cut through the tension again. "Step to the side of the street," she obeyed, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Her palms remained visible, her posture upright. She felt the slight tremor in her hands, a natural reaction to the fear and adrenaline, but she did not let it show. She was aware of every detail. The positioning of the officer's feet, the tension in his shoulders, the subtle tightening of his jaw. She catalogued it all, not for anger, not for revenge, but to understand, to survive, to navigate the unfairness of the moment with calm and dignity. It was then, standing there with the weight of assumptions pressing down, that she realized just how fragile respect can be in the face of prejudice. She had spent her life earning respect, demonstrating integrity, embodying justice, yet here she was, judged on the basis of appearance alone. The injustice of it struck deeply, but she refused to let it control her. She would not shrink. She would not apologize for existing. She drew in a slow, deliberate breath, centering herself. Every instruction from the officer, every subtle display of impatience or authority would be met with calm compliance, measured and dignified. She understood the power of stillness, of presence, of quiet authority. She also understood that this moment, tense and unfair as it was, would not define her, though it might leave a mark on her memory. The officer lingered, still tense, still waiting for some sign of fear or weakness, but she remained composed, her presence quiet but firm like a stone in a rushing river. She had faced challenges before, and she would face this one not with aggression, but with resilience, patience, and the unshakable dignity that had guided her through every trial of her life. In that moment, on that ordinary city street turned stage for an extraordinary confrontation, she became a study in calm authority. Every breath, every gesture, every measured movement communicated a silent message. She would not be intimidated. She would not be defined by bias. And she would face this moment with the same principles that had guided her for decades. And so the standoff continued, the air thick with tension, the assumptions of the officer pressing against the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be diminished. The next moments would be decisive, though neither of them knew it yet. The encounter was far from over, and the story was only beginning to reveal its true depth. The street felt heavier now, every moment stretching longer than it should have. The officer's eyes darted between her hands, the car, and the few onlookers gathering nearby. He seemed impatient, as if the simple act of standing there waiting for her to misbehave was a burden he could no longer tolerate. She, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of fear, frustration, and resolve. Fear because she had no idea how far this encounter might go. Frustration because she could not understand why someone would assume she was guilty simply because of the color of her skin. And resolve because she knew that giving in to panic would only confirm his assumptions. Every second was a battle of patience. She felt the heat of the sun on her back, the gentle hum of distant traffic, and the faint murmur of voices around them. A few more people had stopped, sensing something was wrong, but they were cautious, hesitant to intervene. Some had phones out recording, though she did not notice them in detail. She only knew that in that moment. She had to hold herself steady, to remain composed, and to let her dignity shine through, even in the face of injustice. The officer shifted his weight again, his expression tightening. "Turn around. Hands on the hood again," he barked, his voice sharp and uncompromising. She obeyed, placing her palms flat on the car once more. The metal was cool under her skin, grounding her, a reminder that she was real, present, and human. She breathed slowly in and out, focusing on staying calm while inside. Her emotions churned like stormy waters. Then came a thought, a tiny spark of clarity in the chaos. She had been calm, cooperative, patient, and yet he had treated her as though she were a criminal. His assumptions about her, about who she was, had blinded him to the truth. She had the power to change the course of this encounter, not through confrontation, but through a simple revelation. Her hands pressed lightly on the hood of the car, fingers tracing the faint scratches left by years of use when she slowly adjusted her coat. The crowd, sensing a subtle shift, began to lean forward slightly, their curiosity piqued. She opened her coat gently, revealing the black robe she had worn all day at the courthouse. The robe was heavy with the weight of her work, the countless hours of dedication, and the authority she carried with every decision she made in her courtroom. The officer froze. His hand, which had hovered near his belt, stopped midair, His eyes widened slightly, and for the first time he seemed unsure of how to proceed. His body, which had been so rigid and commanding moments before, softened in a sudden, almost involuntary pause. The reality before him did not match the assumptions he had carried into this encounter. The crowd gasped. A few people murmured quietly, pointing toward her robe, their surprise palpable. Phones clicked, capturing the moment that had shifted so dramatically in an instant. She stood there, calm and composed, her hands now resting at her sides, letting the robe speak for her. The simple, powerful symbol of her authority and experience contrasted sharply with the preconceived notions the officer had brought with him. "I am a judge," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the tense street. It was not a shout, not a demand, but a statement of fact, calm and deliberate. She did not scold him, she did not yell. She simply let the truth be known. Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering, communicating both dignity and authority. For a long moment, he said nothing. He blinked as if trying to process what he had just seen. The tension that had hung so heavily over the street began to shift, replaced with an awkward, uncertain pause. He was no longer the commanding figure who had barked orders moments before. Now he was simply a man confronted with a reality he had not anticipated, a reality that undermined his assumptions completely. She could feel the energy around her change. The bystanders who had been tense and hesitant now relaxed slightly, some whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. Cameras still clicked, but now the focus was on the contrast between her calm authority and the officer's stunned hesitation. She felt a strange sense of vindication, not for herself, but for the principle she had always believed in, that dignity, calmness, and truth could confront even the most misguided assumptions. The officer finally spoke, his voice quieter, less certain. I didn't know." He seemed flustered, as if he were searching for words to justify the unjustifiable. His authority, once so rigid, seemed to crumble under the weight of the truth before him. She did not gloat. She did not yell. She simply held herself steady, letting the robe and her presence communicate what needed to be understood. "Now you know," she said softly, her tone calm but firm. There was no anger in her words, only the quiet force of truth. "And I expect to be treated with the respect any citizen deserves, regardless of assumptions or appearances." The officer shifted again, glancing around at the small crowd, the witnesses and the cameras. He took a step back, finally lowering his hands, the rigid tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He muttered something under his breath, but she did not catch it. She knew that whatever words he chose now would not erase the initial injustice, but they were not important. What mattered was that the moment had shifted, that the assumptions he had carried into the encounter had been challenged in the most undeniable way. She straightened, adjusting the robe slightly, feeling the weight of it around her shoulders. It was more than just clothing. It was a symbol of every late night, every sacrifice, every moment of perseverance that had led her to this point. It was proof that her worth, her authority, and her dignity were not determined by someone else's biases or assumptions. The officer looked at her again, this time with a mixture of embarrassment and uncertainty. He seemed to realize that his behavior had been inappropriate, though perhaps he could not fully articulate it. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear moments ago had shifted completely. She had not raised her voice, she had not been aggressive, yet the truth of her identity had dismantled his assumptions in an instant. The onlookers murmured among themselves, some whispering about what they had just witnessed. Phones were still raised, capturing the moment for the world to see. She did not move to engage with them. She did not need their validation. Her focus remained on the officer, on the quiet assertion of her identity, on the principle that truth and dignity could confront prejudice without violence or anger. You may step back now," she said softly, her tone carrying the calm authority that had defined her career. She did not smile, she did not gloat, but there was a quiet strength in her voice that spoke volumes. She stood tall, every inch of her posture communicating confidence, calm, and unshakable dignity. He stepped back finally, his hands lowering completely. He muttered another word under his breath, unsure whether it was an apology or simply an attempt to regain composure. The tension in the air eased slightly, though it did not disappear entirely. There was still a sense of unease, a lingering awareness of what had almost happened, of the assumptions that had brought them to this moment. She remained still for a moment, letting the silence settle. The robe flowed slightly in the breeze, a subtle reminder of the power of presence, of authority, of truth. Every breath she took was deliberate, controlled, a testament to the strength that had carried her through so many challenges. She had faced prejudice, doubt, and injustice countless times before, but this encounter on the street in broad daylight had been a stark reminder of how deeply assumptions can shape behavior. The officer finally stepped back toward his patrol car, muttering something to himself as he moved. He did not reach for his handcuffs again. He did not issue another order. The encounter that had seemed to teeter on the edge of confrontation had shifted entirely. The assumptions that had fueled the aggression, the bias that had driven the commands, had been challenged in the most undeniable way possible. She adjusted the robe again, straightening the fabric across her shoulders. She could feel the eyes of the crowd, the soft murmur of voices, the quiet clicks of phones capturing the scene. She did not acknowledge them directly. She did not need applause, recognition, or validation. What mattered was that she had stood firm, that she had confronted bias not with anger but with calm authority and truth. The street slowly began to return to its ordinary rhythm. Cars passed by. The wind stirred the leaves in the trees, and the faint hum of distant traffic resumed. Yet for those who had witnessed it, the encounter left a mark. It was a reminder of the fragility of assumptions, the persistence of bias, and the undeniable power of dignity and truth. She took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering tension. The officer remained by his car, glancing occasionally at her, clearly unsure how to proceed. She could have spoken further, demanded an apology, or expressed her frustration, but she chose silence. Her calm presence, her authority, and the simple revelation of her identity had already communicated more than words ever could. In that moment, she felt a quiet sense of victory. Not a victory over the officer personally, but a victory over the assumptions, the bias, and the fear that had fueled the encounter. She had shown that calm, truth, and dignity could confront prejudice in a way that was both undeniable and powerful. And yet, as she looked around, she knew this was not the end. The encounter would linger in her mind, in the memories of the witnesses, and perhaps in the officer's awareness as well. It was a small moment, a brief interaction on a quiet city street, but it carried the weight of history, of injustice, and of resilience. She had faced fear, frustration, and humiliation, and she had emerged with her dignity intact. The tension on the street began to lift slowly, though it did not disappear entirely. The officer had taken a step back, still glancing at her, uncertain, perhaps embarrassed, or perhaps simply unsure of how to regain the sense of control he had initially tried to assert. She stood still, the black robe flowing lightly around her shoulders, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture upright and calm. The small crowd that had gathered lingered, murmuring quietly to one another, sharing whispers of surprise and admiration. Some people lowered their phones, no longer needing to record the escalation. They had seen enough, and what they had seen spoke volumes. She took a deep breath, letting herself feel a mixture of relief and lingering tension. Relief because the immediate threat had passed, that the officer was no longer aggressive, and that she had managed to confront the situation with dignity. Tension because the encounter had been a stark reminder of the fragility of safety, of how easily assumptions and bias could turn even the most ordinary moment into something frightening. The officer shifted his weight again, muttering something under his breath. He walked slowly toward his patrol car, keeping his eyes on her but no longer making any demands. It was clear that the dynamic had changed completely. The air that had once been thick with confrontation was now heavy with uncertainty. A quiet acknowledgement that assumptions could be challenged in ways that authority alone could not undo. She remained standing, allowing herself a moment to process what had just happened. Her mind raced with thoughts, questions, and reflections. How many times had people been judged, harassed, or treated unfairly because of assumptions like the ones she had just faced? How often had dignity been challenged? Not because of actions or choices, but simply because of the color of someone's skin. The questions were heavy, but they were also a reminder of why her work mattered so much, why she had dedicated her life to justice, fairness, and equality. The crowd began to disperse slowly. Some people walked by, shaking their heads in disbelief, muttering about what they had just witnessed. Others lingered a few steps behind, still talking quietly to one another, clearly affected by the interaction. A few offered small nods or murmured words of respect toward her. She acknowledged them briefly with a nod, a quiet gesture that carried no need for gratitude but simply recognized their presence. The officer leaned against his patrol car, clearly struggling to process the encounter. His hands were no longer on his belt, his posture no longer rigid. There was a subtle shift in the way he carried himself, as if the weight of what had just happened had pressed down on him in a way he had not anticipated. She did not gloat, did not taunt, did not offer him any words that could be twisted into confrontation. She simply stood with calm authority, letting the moment speak for itself. She thought about the reactions of the bystanders, about the small but important lesson that had unfolded in front of them. Not a lesson of anger, not a lesson of humiliation, but a lesson in dignity, resilience, and the quiet power of truth. She had not raised her voice. She had not been aggressive. She had simply revealed her identity, her accomplishments, and her humanity, and that had been enough to shift the balance. The officer finally spoke, his voice low, almost uncertain. I apologize, he said, though it was unclear whether it was a true acknowledgement or a reflexive response to the awkwardness of the moment. She did not respond immediately. She knew that words could be fragile, sometimes empty, and that true accountability often required reflection beyond the moment. She simply nodded slightly, allowing the acknowledgement to stand without embellishment or confrontation. Her thoughts turned inward, reflecting on how easily situations like this could escalate into violence, how quickly fear and assumptions could cloud judgment, and how important it was to remain grounded in dignity and truth. She had faced prejudice countless times in her life, but this encounter had been particularly stark, a reminder that even in positions of authority, even in moments of professional respect, bias could rear its head without warning. The street began to feel more ordinary again. Cars passed by, pedestrians resumed their walks, and the distant hum of city life returned. But the moment had left its mark. The encounter had been brief, yet it carried a weight far beyond the few minutes it had taken to unfold. It was a reminder that resilience was not just about personal strength, but about confronting assumptions, challenging injustice, and maintaining dignity even when it felt like the world was against you. She adjusted her robe slightly, smoothing the fabric over her shoulders. It had been a long day, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter had reminded her of the importance of visibility, of showing the world that bias could be confronted not with aggression, but with quiet authority and confidence. She knew that her calm response had likely challenged the officer's assumptions in ways that words alone could not. The officer finally returned to his car, climbing in without further words. She watched him for a moment, noting the subtle tension that remained in his shoulders, the uncertainty in his movements. He had not intended for this interaction to become a lesson, but lessons often emerged in unexpected ways. The power of presence, dignity, and truth had shifted the dynamic entirely. She took a moment to compose herself, inhaling deeply, feeling the stress of the encounter ebb slightly. Her hands had remained visible throughout, her movements deliberate and controlled, and her voice calm. She had not allowed fear to dictate her actions. She had maintained control of herself even when others sought to impose their assumptions and authority unfairly. As she began to walk toward her car, she reflected on the significance of what had just happened. It was not about proving the officer wrong. It was not about humiliation or revenge. It was about asserting her humanity, asserting her dignity, and confronting bias in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. It was about showing that calm authority, truth, and presence could challenge assumptions and create a moment of reflection for those who witnessed it. She reached her car and opened the door carefully. The seat felt familiar, the interior comforting, a small refuge from the tension of the street. She settled into her seat, closing the door gently behind her. The engine roared softly as she started it, the familiar hum of her car grounding her, bringing her back to the ordinary rhythms of life after an extraordinary confrontation. Driving away, she considered the lessons of the day. The encounter had been a reminder that prejudice and bias were still very real, that assumptions could shape behavior in ways both subtle and aggressive. It had also been a reminder that presence, dignity, and calm authority could confront those assumptions in ways that were undeniable. She had faced fear and injustice and had emerged with her dignity intact. Her mind turned to the broader implications. This was not just a personal encounter. It was a reflection of systemic issues, of the subtle and overt ways bias could shape interactions between people, even those who were accomplished, respected, and in positions of authority. She knew that sharing this story, reflecting on it, and using it as a teaching moment could help others recognize bias, confront assumptions, and act with integrity and dignity in their own lives. As she drove through the familiar streets, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter had been challenging, yes, but it had also been empowering. She had shown, in the quietest but most undeniable way, that assumptions could be challenged, that dignity could be maintained, and that presence and calm authority could have a profound impact even in the briefest moments. She thought about the witnesses who had seen the encounter unfold. Some had quietly nodded in respect. Some had whispered to one another about the unexpected display of composure and strength. The memory of their reactions gave her hope. Perhaps in seeing her respond with dignity and calm authority, they would reflect on their own assumptions and biases. Perhaps the moment would linger in their minds, a small but meaningful lesson about fairness, respect, and humanity. She reflected on the officer as well. He had frozen, paused, and stepped back. He had seen a reality that challenged his assumptions and had been forced to confront it, if only briefly. She did not know whether he would carry the lesson forward, but the encounter had undeniably left its mark. Even small moments, she realized, could plant seeds of reflection, awareness, and change. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky as she drove. The city had returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet the encounter lingered in her thoughts. She reflected on the importance of resilience, of calm authority, and of maintaining dignity in the face of bias. She understood that life would continue to present challenges, and that there would be moments where assumptions, prejudice, and injustice would arise unexpectedly. But she also knew that she had the tools, the experience, and the presence of mind to confront such moments without losing herself. As she approached her home, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The encounter had been intense, unfair, and emotionally draining, but she had faced it with strength and dignity. She had maintained her composure, asserted her identity, and challenged assumptions in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. It was a victory not just for herself, but for the principles she had always stood for: justice, fairness, and respect for every human being. She parked her car, stepping out slowly, taking a deep breath as she felt the familiar ground beneath her feet. The street was quiet, the tension of the afternoon giving way to the calm of evening. She closed her eyes for a moment, reflecting on the encounter, on the lessons learned, and on the quiet power of dignity and presence. The officer drove away shortly after, leaving her alone on the street. She did not watch him go. She had no need to. What mattered was not his departure, but the affirmation of her own integrity, strength, and resilience. She had faced an unjust situation and had navigated it with calm, authority, and humanity. As she walked toward her home, she felt a sense of resolve. The encounter had been a stark reminder of the persistence of bias, but it had also been a testament to the power of calm authority and dignity. She knew that she would carry the lessons of the day with her, using them to guide her actions, inspire others, and continue her work in the pursuit of justice and equality.